In a gripping tale of systemic injustice, Julian Knight, a successful CEO, is thrust into the spotlight of activism after witnessing and experiencing racial discrimination. His journey from corporate leader to committed advocate unfolds against a backdrop of deeply ingrained societal and institutional racism. Facing overt prejudices and corrupt practices within the police force, Julian's story exposes the harsh realities of racial profiling and abuse of power. His fight for justice not only reveals the disturbing, pervasive nature of these issues, but also challenges the complicity of corporate structures in maintaining these inequities, sparking a broader movement for change within his community. In the early afternoon light, the elegant, high-ceilinged lobby of a prestigious technology company echoed with the soft clicks of high-powered executives in expensive shoes, discussing multi-million-dollar deals with relaxed confidence. The walls, adorned with abstract art that hinted at digital transformation and innovation, reflected the light through large panoramic windows, casting a serene glow on the polished marble floor. At the center of this corporate ballet stood Julian Knight, the company's CEO, tall and composed. His presence was an intriguing contrast to his subdued attire. A simple dark blue sweater over a pair of well-worn jeans, and modest scuffed shoes that whispered of weekend walks rather than boardroom battles. His skin, a rich ebony, absorbed the sunlight streaming in, giving him an almost ethereal quality amidst the buzz of Silicon Valley's elite. Despite his wealth, Julian drove an older model electric car and lived in a house no larger than necessary for him and his aging Labrador, Max. He believed that his achievements should speak through his work and innovations, not his personal extravagance. This philosophy had always set him apart, in an industry often criticized for its flashy superficiality and sometimes its lack of diversity. Julian's company, Innovatech, was pioneering in AI-driven environmental solutions, a testament to his vision of technology serving humanity. But on this particular day, as he prepared to step out for a quiet lunch at a local diner he favored for its anonymity and homestyle cooking, his mind was not on his latest project. Instead, he was pondering a recent conversation with his sister about the subtle undercurrents of racial bias that still permeated even the highest echelons of tech industries, including his own. The diner, a small, unassuming place named Joe's Grill, was nestled between a used bookstore and a laundry shop in a less affluent part of town, a stark contrast to the upscale environments Julian usually frequented for business meetings. Its windows were adorned with neon signs that had seen better days, and inside, the smell of bacon and strong coffee filled the air, mingling with the sounds of clattering dishes and the local news blaring from a small TV mounted in the corner. As Julian entered, the bell above the door jingled softly, barely audible over the chatter. He chose a booth near the back, sliding into the vinyl seat with a sense of relief at the anonymity the spot offered. His attire didn't draw any attention in the casual setting, exactly as he preferred. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a quick smile and a no-nonsense air, approached him with a menu. "Afternoon. What can I get you?" she asked, not recognizing the man who was regularly featured on tech magazine covers. "Just coffee black, thanks," Julian replied, his voice low and even. He glanced around, noticing a group of men at the counter, glancing in his direction, whispering among themselves. Their looks were curious, slightly puzzled, as if trying to place why someone like him, someone who didn't quite match their expectations of a diner's patron, would choose to eat here. Julian's presence in the diner was a subtle testament to his character. Despite his status, he sought connection with the world beyond the glossy confines of corporate life. Yet even here, he could sense the undercurrents of judgment, the unspoken questions about his belonging. His attention was drawn to a nearby conversation where a local small business owner was lamenting the difficulties of getting a loan. "They see my address, and the conversation changes," the man said, frustration lining his face. Julian's gaze lingered on him, a silent solidarity forming as he too understood being judged on appearances rather than merit. As Julian sipped his coffee, waiting for the anonymity he cherished but rarely received, his mind wandered to the challenges his own employees might face, the systemic barriers that no amount of personal success could fully shield them from. He wondered about his role in this broader narrative, about the impact he could have, not just as a CEO, but as a black man who navigated these two worlds that seemed perpetually at odds. Little did Julian know, his choice of a humble lunch spot that day would set the stage for an unexpected encounter, one that would challenge his perceptions of his own influence and the subtle prejudices that clouded even the most progressive industries. The seeds of conflict were sown, ready to sprout from the fertile ground of everyday interactions, and Julian would soon find himself at the center of a moment that would test the very principles he stood for. As Julian savored the last sips of his coffee, the door to the diner swung open with a brisk momentum, ushering in a gust of autumn air and 2 police officers. Their uniforms crisp and authoritative, badges gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights, they scanned the room with an assertive gaze before settling on the counter to order their lunch. The officers' presence seemed to shift the atmosphere subtly. Conversations dwindled into whispers, and Julian, despite his intention to remain unobtrusive, could feel the weight of their scrutiny. He glanced over, meeting the eyes of one officer, who quickly diverted his gaze with a mix of surprise and suspicion. After placing their order, the taller of the two, a stocky man with a closely cropped beard, leaned against the counter, his eyes wandering back to Julian. This time, his stare lingered longer, a frown creasing his forehead. Julian, aware of the unwelcome attention, turned his focus back to the remnants of his meal, trying to shake off the discomfort. "Excuse me, sir," the officer called out as he approached Julian's booth. The diner fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding scene. "Can I see some identification?" Julian looked up, his expression composed, but his mind racing with the implications of the request. "May I ask why, officer?" "We had a report of suspicious activity in the area." "You don't look like you're from around here," the officer said, his tone implying more than just geographic unfamiliarity. Julian's heart tightened. The subtext was clear, and the gaze of the diner's patrons burned into him. Yet, he responded with measured calmness, pulling out his wallet to show his ID. "I'm just here for lunch," he stated, his voice steady. The officer took Julian's ID, examining it closely. "Julian Knight," he read aloud, his eyebrows lifting in recognition, or perhaps disbelief. "CEO of Innovatech, huh? You're a long way from the tech district." "Yes, I am," Julian replied simply, reclaiming his ID as the officer handed it back, a touch reluctantly. The waitress, who had been hovering nearby, chimed in, her voice a mix of annoyance and defense. "He's done nothing wrong, just having his coffee like everyone else." The officer nodded, albeit non-committally, and returned to his partner, whispering something that made the other officer glance back at Julian with a frown. Despite their departure from his table, the air remained thick with unspoken judgments. Julian tried to shake off the incident as he prepared to leave, but the encounter had stirred something deep within him. The brief confrontation was a stark reminder of the societal barriers that still existed, regardless of one's accomplishments. It wasn't just the request for identification, it was the implication that he didn't belong, that he was inherently suspect. Back at his office, Julian's thoughts were clouded with the morning's events. He sat in his sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the city, the hum of his computer and the distant sounds of traffic far below, doing little to distract him from his frustration. The injustice was minor compared to what many faced daily, but it was a piercing reminder of the pervasive racial biases that continued to divide. His phone rang, snapping him out of his reverie. It was Michelle, his director of communications, with an update on a new campaign. Julian listened, offering the necessary approvals, but his responses were automatic, his usual enthusiasm dampened. As the day wore on, Julian's mind replayed the diner scene. His position had afforded him a shield of sorts, a barrier against overt discrimination, but the shield was not impenetrable. The microaggressions, the subtle reminders of how society viewed him despite his status, were a constant battle. Determined to not let the day's events define his mood, Julian decided to take a proactive step. He called a meeting with his diversity and inclusion team, setting it for the next morning. It was time, he decided, to review the company's policies, and perhaps more importantly, to share his own experiences with his staff. If change was to happen, it needed to start from within, from understanding and addressing the biases that seeped into even the most progressive environments. That night at home, Julian sat in his living room, Max at his feet, as he reviewed notes for the upcoming meeting. His mind, however, was only partially on the task. He thought about his sister's words, about the systemic challenges they discussed, and about the role he could play in making a difference. The frustration of the day had settled into a quiet resolve. Julian knew that his experiences were not unique, but rather part of a larger narrative of racial profiling and discrimination that affected countless others. His position allowed him a platform, and perhaps a responsibility, to advocate for change. Tomorrow's meeting would be the first step Julian planned, not just to discuss policies, but to share his own story, to put a personal face on an often impersonal issue. It was time to challenge the status quo, to spark conversation, and to drive real change within his sphere of influence. As he set his notes aside and prepared for bed, Julian felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and potential setbacks, but also with opportunities for progress. The conflict at the diner had been a jarring reminder of the work still needed to combat prejudice and injustice. Yet, it also reinforced Julian's resolve to use his voice and his position to advocate for those who faced similar challenges daily. Tomorrow would be a new day, a chance to make a difference, and Julian was ready to meet it head-on. Julian's resolve was tested the following morning as he entered the conference room, his stride confident, yet heavy with the weight of what he intended to reveal. The diversity and inclusion team, along with several senior executives, awaited him. As he launched into the agenda, his voice was steady, but beneath that veneer, a storm was brewing. "We're not just talking about policies today," Julian began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We're talking about lives, about the impact our environment has on people every day, and I want to share something personal with you all." Julian paused, the room's attention fixed on him, hanging on the precipice of his words. He recounted the incident at the diner, his experience tinged with the discomfort and unfairness that had colored the encounter. The room was quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Most were supportive, nodding in understanding and sympathy, but a few looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. The reality of their CEO's encounter with racial profiling was a discomforting wake-up call. As the discussion opened up, Mitchell, one of the senior project managers and a longtime ally of Julian, was the first to speak. "It's one thing to hear about these incidents in the news or in training. It's another to hear it happen to you, Julian. We need to do more than just talk." Encouraged by Mitchell's support, Julian proposed a new initiative to partner with local law enforcement on bias training and community engagement. "We need to be part of the solution, not just in our offices, but in our community," Julian asserted, setting the stage for deeper involvement in social justice, extending beyond corporate boundaries. The meeting ended with a renewed commitment to action, and Julian felt a cautious optimism. But as he left the room, his phone buzzed, an alert from his security team. "Mr. Knight, there's been an incident at the parking garage involving one of our interns and the police. We need you there immediately." His heart sank. The specter of his own recent encounter loomed large as he hurried to the garage, the crisp morning air doing little to cool his mounting apprehension. Upon arriving, Julian saw flashing police lights and a small crowd gathered. At the center was Tariq, a young black intern who Julian knew was a diligent and bright contributor to Innovatech. Tariq stood with his hands up, visibly shaking, as two officers questioned him aggressively beside his own car, a car they had mistaken for stolen. Julian approached calmly, his voice clear and authoritative. "Officers, can I help here?" His presence drew a pause in the questioning. "We're handling a reported vehicle theft." One officer, who Julian recognized as one from the diner, responded curtly. "This is his vehicle," Julian interjected, pointing to Tariq. "He's part of my team." The officers exchanged a glance, the tension palpable. "We have protocols to follow," the other officer replied, skepticism evident in his tone. Julian's frustration mounted, but he kept his composure. "And I respect that, but you're making a mistake. I can vouch for him personally." As the officers hesitated, Julian turned to Tariq, asking him softly to show his vehicle registration. With trembling hands, Tariq complied, producing the documents that confirmed his ownership. The crowd watched, a mix of employees and passers-by, their phones out, recording the confrontation. The realization that they were being filmed seemed to pressurize the situation further. And finally, the officers backed down, mumbling apologies. Julian addressed Tariq, ensuring he was unharmed, then faced the officers. "This incident will not go unnoticed. I expect better from our local law enforcement. We'll be in touch." The crowd dispersed slowly as the officers left, but the damage was done. Julian's mind raced with the implications of what had just unfolded. He needed to escalate his efforts, to make a public stand, not just for his employees, but for his community. Later that day, Julian called a press conference, a decisive move that was unusual for the typically media-shy CEO. Standing before the cameras, Julian recounted both the diner and the garage incidents, linking them to a broader narrative of racial profiling and systemic bias. Our commitment at Innovatech is not just to innovation in technology, but to being a beacon for justice and equality in our community, Julian declared, his voice firm, his demeanor resolute. As the press conference concluded, the air buzzed with the click of cameras and the murmur of reporters. Julian's words were out there, casting ripples that would inevitably provoke responses. That night, alone in his office, Julian reflected on the day's events. He had crossed a threshold, stepping into a public arena that was fraught with challenges but also ripe with opportunity. He knew the road ahead would be tough, the backlash potentially severe, but there was no turning back now. The anticipation of the community's and media's response weighed on him. He had opened a door, a confrontation that was necessary and overdue. As he gazed out at the city skyline, the lights blurred into the darkness, mirroring the uncertainty and resolve that battled within him. Julian was ready to fight a systemic battle that was much larger than himself. Tomorrow, he would face whatever came with the same resolve that had brought him this far. The challenge was daunting, but Julian Knight was not one to step back from a fight worth fighting. With the stakes set high and the city watching, Julian prepared for the fallout, ready to lead the charge for change. The next steps he took could alter the course of his life and his community forever. In the wake of the press conference, Julian sat alone in his expansive office, the city lights sprawling before him through the panoramic windows, reflecting off the glass and casting a glow over his somber expression. The media had erupted with coverage, the public reaction a mixed swell of support and skepticism. The phone had rung incessantly, journalists seeking further comments, community leaders expressing solidarity, and a few hate-filled voices piercing through with scalding criticism. Tension in the city was palpable. The stakes had been raised not just for Julian, but for Innovatech and the broader community that watched closely, gauging his every move. His stand against racial profiling, once a private battle, had catapulted into the public arena, drawing lines that some were reluctant to cross. The next morning, Julian arrived at the office earlier than usual. The reception area was quiet, the usual buzz of activity subdued, as if the building itself was holding its breath. As he made his way to his office, Julian noticed the glances from his employees, some admiring, others uncertain. The air was thick with unspoken questions about what would come next. Mitchell was waiting for him, a look of concern etched across his face. "Julian, you've kicked a hornet's nest. Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" His voice was low, tinged with worry, but underscored with respect. Julian nodded, his jaw set. "It's not just about me anymore, Mitch. It's about setting a precedent, about showing that we stand for more than profits. We stand for our people, for justice." As they spoke, an urgent email notification popped up on Julian's computer from his legal team. The police had issued a statement in response to Julian's accusations, defending their officers' actions and subtly threatening legal repercussions for defamation. The battle lines were drawn sharper now, the implications more severe than just bad press. Julian's resolve hardened. "Prepare a response. We'll need to address this head-on," he instructed. His mind racing through strategies, he scheduled a meeting with his legal and public relations teams. The day suddenly mapped out with back-to-back discussions and decisions that would ripple outward in ways he could only begin to anticipate. As the day unfolded, the office became a war room. Julian and his team crafted statements, planned community outreach, and consulted with civil rights lawyers. Every action was measured, every word weighed for impact. Outside, news vans and reporters gathered, a constant reminder of the scrutiny they were under. The tension reached a peak in the late afternoon when Julian received a call from the mayor, urging him to moderate his stance for the sake of community peace. Julian listened, his face impassive, his fingers drumming on the desk. "With all due respect, Mayor, peace built on injustice is no peace at all," he replied before ending the call. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the city, Julian knew the next step would be crucial, He called a late-night, all-hands meeting for Innovatech staff. The auditorium was filled with murmurs as employees gathered, the air electric with anticipation and anxiety. Julian stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding silence. "Tonight we stand at a crossroads," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "We can either step back and let fear dictate our actions, or we can move forward, together, and fight for what's right." His speech was impassioned, a clear call to action. He spoke of the challenges they faced, not just as a company, but as a community. He shared his vision for an Innovatech that led not just in technology, but in social justice. The response was immediate and powerful. Applause broke out, some stood in ovation, and even those who had been uncertain now nodded in agreement, swept up in the moment's urgency. Julian's words had galvanized them, turning fear and uncertainty into resolve. But as the crowd dispersed, the real test began. Julian remained behind, the weight of the coming days pressing down on him. The city was watching, the country was watching, and the decisions he made now would define his legacy. That night, as Julian prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a message that chilled him to the core. An anonymous threat, stark against the backdrop of his illuminated screen. "Back down, or else." The words were stark, a sinister echo in the quiet of his office. Julian stood by the window, looking out at the city that seemed to hold its breath along with him. The threat was a stark reminder of the stakes at play, but it also steeled his resolve. He wouldn't back down, not when so much was at stake. He had stood up to challenge the status quo, and he would see it through, no matter the personal cost. The night was deep and dark as he left the building, the silent streets a contrast to the storm that raged within him. Julian was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the conviction that the fight he was leading was not just for him, but for all those who had suffered in silence. The climax of his struggle loomed on the horizon, fraught with danger, but also with the hope of change. As Julian drove through the quiet streets, he rehearsed the steps for the coming battle, knowing that the next days would either break him or herald a new dawn for justice. The city passed by, a blur of shadows and light, a stage set for a showdown that could change everything. The air was tense with anticipation as Julian Knight stood at the podium in the packed city hall, the audience a mosaic of citizens, journalists, and city officials. Among them sat Officer Daniels. The very emblem of the systemic issues Julian had vowed to combat. His uniform was immaculate, his expression unreadable, yet his presence alone was a provocation. As Julian began to speak, his voice resonated through the hall, clear and commanding. "We gather here not just to speak, but to act against the injustices that plague our community," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling on Officer Daniels. "We seek accountability, transparency, and above all, respect for every citizen, irrespective of color or creed." Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed the weight of Julian's words. The atmosphere was charged, each participant acutely aware that this was not just another public consultation, but a pivotal confrontation. The meeting progressed with community members voicing concerns and experiences, painting a vivid picture of the disparities and prejudices that had become too common. Julian listened, nodding in acknowledgement, his resolve hardening with each testimony. As the floor opened for questions, Officer Daniels stood, his stance authoritative as he addressed Julian. "Mr. Knight, while your intentions might be noble, aren't you exaggerating the situation to push your personal agenda?" His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of challenge that rippled through the room. The crowd murmured, tension rising like heat. Julian met Daniels' gaze, his response deliberate and firm. "This isn't about personal agendas, officer. It's about correcting a system that's failed too many for too long. Or are you suggesting these people," he gestured to the audience, "their experiences are fabrications?" Daniels' jaw tightened. "Not fabrications, Mr. Knight, but perhaps misunderstandings," he retorted, implying a downplaying that caused a stir among the attendees. "Misunderstandings," Julian echoed, allowing the word to hang in the air, heavy and incredulous. He took a slight pause, collecting his thoughts for maximum impact. "Let's speak plainly then. When a young man is stopped and frisked without cause, or when a family lives in fear of those sworn to protect them because of their skin color, are these misunderstandings?" The room erupted in applause, supporting Julian's retort. Daniels faltered, the discomfort evident as he scanned the room, finding little sympathy. Seeing the shift in momentum, Julian pressed on, his voice rising passionately. We need more than dismissive reassurances. We need action, we need change, and if those in power refuse to provide it, then it's our duty to demand it. Officer Daniels, now visibly shaken, attempted to interject, but Julian raised his hand, stopping him mid-sentence. No, officer. You've had your chance. Now it's time for us to rebuild trust and ensure justice for all. As Daniels sat down, defeated, a key figure in the audience stood up. It was the mayor. His presence was a surprise to many, including Julian. The mayor cleared his throat, all eyes fixed on him as he began to speak, his tone conciliatory. Julian Knight has called upon us to face some uncomfortable truths today. I believe it is time for our police department to embrace comprehensive reforms. Officer Daniels, the practices and prejudices you defend can no longer be tolerated in our city. The revelation of the mayor's stance was a turning point, indicating a significant shift in local government's approach to the issue. Julian nodded in appreciation, the support from such a high-ranking official amplifying the impact of the meeting. As the assembly concluded, the crowd dispersed, buzzing with energy and renewed hope. Officer Daniels hurried out, avoiding eye contact with Julian and the mayor. Julian remained behind, discussing potential strategies with community leaders, invigorated by the progress, but aware of the long road ahead. After the hall had emptied, Julian stood alone on the stage, reflecting on the night's events. The confrontation had galvanized the community, and while significant challenges remained, the path forward seemed a little clearer. However, he knew that Daniel's quiet departure spoke of unresolved issues that might still surface. Julian's phone buzzed, breaking his contemplation. It was a message from his assistant, alerting him to a surge in social media support, but also to threats that had been made against him. The stakes were indeed life-changing, and as he stepped down from the stage, Julian felt the weight of his role not just as a CEO, but as a leader in a divided community. The night air was cool as he walked to his car, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of the city. As Julian drove away, he pondered the uncertain future. Tonight, he had stood his ground, and tomorrow, he would need to stand even firmer. Julian knew that the true measure of tonight's success would be seen in the days and weeks to come. The confrontation had sparked a flame, but the fire of change was volatile and unpredictable. As he neared his home, the reality of his solitude in this fight struck him deeply. Though surrounded by supporters, the journey ahead was his to lead. With resolve stealing his every thought, Julian was ready to face whatever came next, driven by a profound commitment to justice and equality. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but also with the promise of real change. As he parked his car and looked up at the starry sky, Julian felt a momentary peace, ready to continue the fight, no matter the cost. The day had finally arrived for Julian to confront the systemic injustices that had long plagued his community and now threatened his own sense of security. The venue was the City Council chamber, a grand room typically reserved for municipal debates and public hearings. Today, it served as the battleground for a confrontation that Julian hoped would spark a transformative change throughout the city. Julian stood at the center of the chamber, his figure solitary but resolute under the ornate ceiling. Across from him, seated behind a long polished table, were various city officials, including Officer Daniels, whose presence was like a dark cloud looming over the proceedings. The chamber was packed, the air thick with anticipation, and the murmur of an anxious crowd. As the hearing commenced, Julian's eyes met Officer Daniels, whose expression was smug, almost confident, betraying no sign of doubt about his stance or his power. Julian's heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and resolve, but his voice was calm and commanding as he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today, not just to discuss, but to rectify a long-standing issue that affects every resident of this city. Racial profiling and police misconduct, Julian declared, his gaze sweeping across the room, then settling intently on Officer Daniels. Officer Daniels smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he were merely an observer rather than the subject of these accusations. Mr. Knight, while your concerns are noted, I believe you are overstating the situation to serve your own narrative, Daniels retorted, his voice steady but tinged with condescension. Julian paused, allowing the weight of Daniel's dismissal to hang in the air, then responded, "Is it an overstated situation when innocent people are targeted based on the color of their skin, when they are harassed in their daily lives?" He turned slightly to address the audience, his voice rising in passion. "No, it is not just my narrative, it is the lived reality of many in this room." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding vigorously, others clapping. Daniel's smirk faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Julian continued, "Today, I bring not just my words, but evidence." He motioned to a team member, who handed him a folder. Julian laid out photographs, incident reports, and testimonials from community members, all pointing to a pattern of behavior that Daniels and his cohort could no longer deny. As Julian presented each piece of evidence, Daniel's composure began to crack. He tried to interrupt, to regain control of the narrative, but Julian's steady, factual presentation left little room for doubt. The turning point came when Julian revealed a recorded conversation between Daniels and another officer, discussing how they targeted minority neighborhoods to meet their arrest quotas. The recording, played aloud for all to hear, filled the room with a palpable sense of betrayal and disgust. The revelation was damning. Daniels sat, mouth agape, his face turning a shade paler. The officials whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. "Officer Daniels," Julian addressed him directly, his voice now a powerful force echoing through the chamber. "How do you explain this?" Daniels stuttered, his usual bravado crumbling under the weight of his exposed prejudices. That was out of context," he managed to say, but his voice was weak, unconvincing. Julian shook his head, his disappointment evident. "There is no context in which these actions are justified, none." The officials began to converse urgently among themselves, the reality of the situation dawning on them. The mayor, who had been silent up until now, finally stood. "This is deeply troubling," he admitted, looking squarely at Daniels. "We need to take immediate action to address this." The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices, with community members calling for Daniels' dismissal and for reforms within the police department. Daniels tried to argue, to salvage his career, but the evidence was too overwhelming, his guilt too apparent. As the hearing adjourned, Julian felt a mixture of relief and heaviness. He had won a significant battle, but the war against systemic racism and corruption was far from over. As he packed up his documents, the mayor approached him. "Mr. Knight, what you've done today takes courage. We will take it from here. Expect changes, and soon," the mayor promised, extending his hand. Julian shook his hand, nodding. "Thank you, Mayor. I will hold you to that promise." Walking out of the chamber, Julian was met with cheers from the crowd, but his mind was already on the next steps. He knew that today's victory was crucial, but the path ahead would require continued vigilance and action. As he stepped outside into the brisk evening air, Julian paused, looking back at the city hall. The battle was won, but the journey continued. Tomorrow, he would begin again, ready to face whatever challenges came next, armed with the knowledge that change was possible, and it was coming. This moment of triumph was tinged with the reality of the struggle ahead. Julian knew that the road to justice was long and fraught with setbacks, but he was prepared to lead the charge, no matter the cost. The city, and indeed the country, watched and waited, ready to see how far Julian Knight would go to reshape the world around him. In the weeks following the City Hall confrontation, Julian Knight watched as his city began to transform. Officer Daniels was suspended pending a full investigation, and the mayor had initiated a comprehensive review of police practices. These were the first tangible results of Julian's relentless pursuit of justice, and while they marked a significant victory, Julian knew the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. As he sat in his office one quiet morning, Julian reflected on the changes not just around him, but within himself. The battle had taken a toll, but it had also galvanized his resolve. He felt more connected to his community than ever before, and his role as a leader had expanded beyond the realms of business into civic activism. Julian realized that this fight had become a part of his identity, a part he no longer wished to separate from his corporate persona. The impact of his actions rippled beyond immediate policy changes. There was a shift in the community's engagement with local governance. Attendance at city council meetings had grown, and more citizens were voicing their concerns and demanding accountability. Julian's courage had sparked a flame of activism that was now self-sustaining. However, the situation with Officer Daniels was a stark reminder of the battles yet to be fought. Though Daniels had lost much of his former influence, he remained a symbol of the systemic resistance to change. Some in the police force rallied to his defense, viewing the reforms as an indictment of their entire profession rather than a necessary correction of its flaws. This division had led to tense standoffs between reform advocates and traditionalists within the force, complicating the path to comprehensive reform. Julian's personal growth through these tumultuous times was evident to those around him. He had become a more vocal, more visible advocate for justice, using his platform to effect change in ways he had never imagined possible. His company, Innovatech, had also adapted, integrating social responsibility into its core mission, which resonated deeply both within the workforce and among the public. One afternoon, Julian organized a community forum held at the local university, aimed at fostering dialogue between the police and the residents. The event was well attended, with lively discussions and occasionally heated debates. It was during one of these sessions that Julian came face to face with Officer Daniels. Once again, Daniels had come not as a speaker, but as a civilian, a sign that he too was searching for ways to adapt to the new realities. The encounter was unexpectedly civil. Daniels approached Julian during a break, extending his hand in a gesture that was cautiously accepted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Daniels admitted, his voice low. "I can't change the past, but I'm here to learn, maybe to help make things right if I can." Julian nodded, appreciating the effort. "It's a long process," he replied, "but acknowledgement is a good first step." Their conversation didn't erase the history or the damage done, but it was a testament to the potential for change. Even among those who had been part of the problem, Julian felt a cautious optimism, a sense that perhaps reconciliation was possible. As the forum concluded, Julian stood before the gathered crowd, feeling a mix of triumph and the weight of ongoing responsibility. "Today marks not an end, but a beginning," he announced, his voice echoing in the packed auditorium. "Our work continues, but together, we are rewriting the story of our city." Leaving the university, Julian felt a profound connection to the energized crowd that spilled out onto the streets, their conversations buzzing with plans and possibilities. The change was real, palpable, and it was just the start. In the days that followed, Julian found himself at the center of a new narrative, one of hope and hard-won progress. Innovatech's role in the community expanded, partnering with local organizations to provide technology training and support to underserved areas. Julian's personal journey had become inseparable from his professional mission, each reinforcing the other. Yet, as he looked out over the city from his office window, Julian knew that the peace and progress were fragile. The forces of resistance were regrouping, and new challenges loomed on the horizon. But he was ready, fortified by battles fought and victories won, to face whatever came next. This story of struggle and resilience was far from over. Julian understood that each day brought new battles, but also new opportunities to forge a fairer, more just society. His commitment was now his legacy, one that would inspire others to join the fight, ensuring that the flame of change, once ignited, would never be extinguished. As the sun set over the city skyline, painting it in hues of orange and purple, Julian Knight stood by his office window, contemplating the journey that had reshaped his life and his community. The events of the past months had not only transformed him into a catalyst for change, but also highlighted the profound resilience and potential for reform within society. Julian's story began as a personal crusade against injustices he witnessed and experienced firsthand. However, it quickly evolved into a broader movement, touching the lives of countless individuals who had long felt marginalized and voiceless. Through his actions, Julian demonstrated that one person's courage could indeed make a difference, serving as a beacon for others to follow. Throughout the narrative, Julian's character evolved significantly. Initially, a successful but relatively detached CEO, he was thrust into the spotlight not by choice, but by circumstance. The discrimination and challenges he faced forced him out of his corporate shell, compelling him to engage with his community in ways he had never anticipated. This transformation was not merely about taking a stand, but about understanding the deep-seated issues that affected his employees, neighbors, and fellow citizens. Julian's journey was marked by moments of doubt and despair, yet these were invariably overcome by his growing resolve to effect change. By the end, he had not only addressed the issues of police misconduct and racial profiling, but had also inspired his company to integrate social responsibility into its core mission. This change within Innovatech exemplified how businesses could play a crucial role in advocating for and implementing social justice. The narrative also cast a stark light on systemic problems that extend far beyond a single community or individual. The challenges Julian faced underscored the pervasive nature of racism and abuse of power within institutions designed to protect and serve. His story revealed how deeply ingrained these issues are and how challenging they are to uproot. However, Julian's efforts also demonstrated that change is possible. The reforms initiated in response to his campaign, ranging from police training programs to community outreach initiatives, suggested that with persistent effort and widespread support, systemic transformation can be achieved. These changes serve as a testament to the idea that while systems are slow to change, they are not immutable. Julian's story is not just a tale of personal triumph, but a call to action for everyone who encounters it. It serves as a reminder that indifference to injustice only perpetuates inequality, and that active engagement is crucial for progress. Julian's transformation into a community leader illustrates that it is not enough to be successful in one's field. True leadership encompasses a responsibility to uplift others and address the broader societal issues that impact us all. This narrative encourages the audience to not only reflect on their own positions within their communities, but also to consider how they might contribute to dismantling the barriers that hinder justice and equality. It suggests that each person has a role to play, whether as an advocate, a listener, an educator, or a supporter. As the story closes, the audience is left with a profound sense of hope, mixed with a recognition of the challenges that remain. Julian's example serves as a powerful motivator for individuals and communities to seek out what is just and to strive for a society where equality is not just an ideal, but a reality. In reflecting on the events that transpired, Julian understands that his journey has only just begun. The path forward is fraught with obstacles, but it is also lined with opportunities for growth and further achievements. His story does not end here, but rather opens a new chapter where his actions will continue to influence and inspire. The emotional resonance of Julian's narrative lies in its universality, the struggle against injustice, the power of resilience, and the importance of community. These themes bind the story to the hearts of its audience, encouraging them to believe in the possibility of change and the power of one individual to spark a movement. As night falls and the city lights begin to twinkle beneath him, Julian turns away from the window, ready to face whatever tomorrow brings. Armed with the knowledge that change is hard, slow, and often painful, but ultimately rewarding. This message, hopeful yet grounded, is what he carries forward, and what he hopes to instill in all who hear his story. As the story of Julian Knight draws to a close, it leaves an indelible mark on the landscape of social justice and corporate responsibility. Julian's transformation from a successful but insulated CEO to a committed activist and community leader encapsulates a journey of profound personal growth and societal impact. His story is not just one of overcoming adversity, but of using his platform and resources to challenge deep-seated injustices and inspire widespread change. Julian began this journey somewhat reluctantly, propelled by circumstances that highlighted the stark realities of racial prejudice and systemic abuse of power. Initially, his actions were reactions to specific incidents of injustice, but as events unfolded, his role evolved into that of a proactive leader, seeking not just to address symptoms, but to cure the systemic disease. This evolution was marked by a significant shift in how Julian viewed his influence and responsibilities, both as a CEO and as a citizen. His personal growth is characterized by a newfound resilience and a deepening of his commitment to his community. Where once his focus was on technological innovations and business success, it is now equally centered on social equity and creating opportunities for those who have historically been marginalized moving forward. Julian plans to integrate these goals into every aspect of his professional endeavors and to continue advocating for change at local, national, and even global levels. Julian's story reflects broader societal issues, such as systemic racism and the abuse of power within institutions meant to serve the public. His experiences underscore the complexity of these issues and the multifaceted approach required to address them. It is clear that such problems are deeply entrenched, not only within specific organizations like the police force, but within the very fabric of society. The narrative also highlights the potential for systemic change that can arise from individual actions. Julian's efforts led to tangible reforms in police practices and opened a broader dialogue about racial inequality in his city. This serves as a powerful example of how dedicated individuals can influence systemic reform, providing a blueprint for others to follow. Julian's story is intended to inspire the audience to recognize their own potential to effect change. It is a call to action, not just for those in positions of power, but for anyone who sees injustice and feels compelled to address it. The narrative emphasizes that while the journey towards equality and fairness is fraught with challenges, progress is achievable through perseverance, resilience, and collective effort. The audience is encouraged to engage actively with their communities, to listen to and amplify marginalized voices, and to work towards inclusive solutions that address the root causes of social inequities. Julian's story is a testament to the fact that change often starts with individual courage to confront uncomfortable truths and the determination to transform those truths into action. As we reflect on Julian's journey, we are left with a mix of emotions: outrage at the injustices he confronted, admiration for his courage and tenacity, and hope for the future he is helping to shape. His story resonates emotionally because it touches on universal desires for fairness, respect, and community. It reminds us that, while the fight against injustice can be daunting, it is also filled with opportunities for growth and enlightenment. The story concludes on a note of cautious optimism. Julian, standing before the city as both a leader and a learner, remains committed to the cause of justice. The path forward is not entirely clear, and challenges remain, but there is a sense of potential and possibility. The change Julian has sparked is only the beginning, and his continued efforts promise to keep the flame of progress alive. In closing, Julian's story does not end with the final words of this narrative. It continues in every action he takes, in every life he touches, and in every person who, inspired by his journey, chooses to stand up against injustice. It is a perpetual reminder that while the work is hard and the road is long, the pursuit of justice is always worth the effort. As the curtain draws on Julian Knight's transformative journey, the narrative arcs to a compelling closure that encapsulates growth, revelation, and a spurred movement towards systemic change. This tale, while deeply personal, mirrors the broader societal schisms and the power inherent in steadfast resolve and principled leadership. Julian, once a bystander in the world of social activism, emerges as a linchpin in the fight against systemic injustice, showcasing the profound impact one individual can wield against the monolith of institutional prejudice. Julian's evolution is marked by a profound awakening to the realities outside the boardrooms and shareholder meetings. Initially propelled by a visceral response to witnessed injustice, Julian's journey through activism is not just reactive but grows to be strategic and visionary. The challenges he faced, from confronting police misconduct to addressing corporate complicity and societal inequities, reshaped his worldview and refined his role. Both as a CEO and a community leader, Julian has learned that true leadership transcends profit margins and productivity metrics. It involves nurturing a community, advocating for the voiceless, and sometimes standing alone against the tide. Looking forward, Julian plans to integrate his activism with his business acumen more seamlessly than ever. Innovatech, under his stewardship, is poised to become a model for how corporations can not only adapt to, but lead in the implementation of equitable practices. Julian's future is one of continued advocacy, where each business decision is weighed against its social impact, ensuring that his company remains a force for good. Julian's story is a stark reminder of the pervasive tendrils of racism and abuse of power that infiltrate even the most progressive societies. It highlights that these are not issues of individual misconduct, but symptoms of deep-rooted systemic flaws that require bold, persistent interventions. Julian's confrontation with these forces lays bare the complex interplay between power, privilege, and prejudice. The narrative also serves as a blueprint for enacting change. Julian's actions inspire a ripple effect, encouraging others within his sphere of influence to take a stand. His story underscores the significant impact that informed, committed leadership can have on reforming practices not only within a single organization, but across a community and beyond. Julian's narrative is a clarion call to all who encounter it to recognize their capacity to foster change. It is an invitation to challenge the status quo, to question long-standing practices, and to take bold actions toward fairness and justice. The story emphasizes that while no single action can dismantle systemic barriers overnight, continuous and collective efforts can create sustained change. Julian's journey inspires hope and determination, urging us to believe in the power of concerted action and ethical leadership in overcoming societal inequities. As this story concludes, the audience is left with a mix of emotions: outrage at the injustices detailed, admiration for Julian's tenacity and courage, and hope inspired by the changes he has initiated. This narrative resonates because it speaks to the universal longing for fairness and the common dread of injustice. It taps into the collective desire to see wrongs righted and communities uplifted. Ending on a memorable note, Julian's story is not just a tale of overcoming adversity, but a testament to the enduring human spirit. His final reflection offers not just closure, but a gateway to future possibilities. As Julian looks out over the city he has helped to transform, he sees not a landscape of challenges, but a horizon brimming with opportunities. His final message to the audience is one of empowerment. Change starts with a single step, a single voice, a single act of courage. Be that voice. Take that step. Enact that courage. Together, we can redefine the fabric of our society. Thus, the story of Julian Knight concludes, leaving a lasting impact on all who journey with him through the trials and triumphs of his crusade for justice. It's a narrative that challenges, educates, and inspires, ensuring that while the book may close, the story will continue in the actions and aspirations of each reader moved by his legacy.